Good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Maricola, Manager of Adult Services at New Canaan Library. Tonight's program, Movements in Cinema, Italian Cinema in the 1960s, will explore various factors and influences that produced some of Italy's most renowned and artistic films. Before we start, I'd like to thank my colleague, Kathy Blantz, for arranging this program. And I'd like to ask that our attendees use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask questions throughout the program. Our speaker, Michael Cramer, holds the position of Professor of Film History at Sarah Lawrence in Bronxville, New York. His areas of teaching and expertise include Italian, French, and American film of the 1960s and 70s, as well as media theory. He is the author of the book Utopian Television, Rossellini, Watkins, and Godard Beyond Cinema, and he is the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Frederick Jameson and Film Theory, which will be released this year. Thank you for being with us tonight, Professor Cramer. The virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, Anthony, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. So in just a moment, I'm going to start a PowerPoint, which will, serve as the main visual aid that I'm using during the presentation. Of course, we need to have images if we're looking at films. Ideally, we would have all sorts of video clips. I've struggled a little bit in my teaching with, how to get those to get across cleanly with no technical problems to my students. And it turns out the easiest way to do this is just to kind of find some clips that are already online. So there are a couple points at the talk where I'm going to enter a link to a YouTube video into the chat. How many depends on how much I get through and the time, but just to give people a heads up that at some points you will want to click on those links to watch the videos or the film clips that I'll be talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint now and start with that. Okay. So even though my talk tonight is focusing on the 1960s and actually very specifically on 1960, I did want to give just some very broad background about the history of Italian cinema to provide some context to what I'm talking about. And, just to sort of say right off the bat, the reason that I'm looking at 1960 in particular is that this is often considered kind of the high point of post-war Italian cinema. It's a moment where a lot of breakthroughs are happening in terms of people creating really distinctive new film styles that are really making an impression around the world, sometimes even on a commercial level, other times more on a critical level. But it's also a moment in which Italy has undergone an extremely dramatic change since the end of World War II, and you're beginning to see that registered in cinema around this time. So that's part of the rationale. But in any case, I wanted to, again, just sort of give a really broad sort of sketch of Italian film history to sort of talk about how we get here. And this is going to be very quick, but I think, hopefully it'll still be useful. So Italy gets into the production of film fairly early on. We have the first projected films are screened in 1895, and you're starting to see film production in Italy about 10 years after that. So it's not as early as, say, the United States or France, but on a comparative scale in terms of everywhere else in the world, it's quite early. And one of the things that Italians do that they kind of figured out how to do before Americans was really big budget, spectacular feature film. And indeed, Italy is one of the first countries that starts producing feature-length films, right? Films that run 2 or even 3 hours in the early 1910s. And this was something that was not the norm in the United States. Indeed, a lot of the impetus to start creating these feature-length movies does come from a desire to mimic the Italian films on the part of Americans. And the few films that I'm just showing little stills from here at the beginning were all quite popular in the US as well. Italian films were noted for their quality. And as you can see in both of these images, Quo Vadis and The Last Days of Pompeii, these are both from 1913, these are historical films, and that was kind of the trademark of Italian cinema, right? Roman epics, biblical epics, those are the big two. Of course, they overlap, right? We see that in Quo Vadis or in a movie like Ben-Hur. So in any case, the other thing you can see from these stills is that they really put a premium on sets and costumes costumes, and just kind of the really detailed recreation of these historical environments. So above all else, right, it wasn't necessarily the stories of these films that were distinctive or that were even the main selling point. It was really the visuals, right, of bringing history to life, but also just, as we would say nowadays, putting money on the screen, right? They look like they cost a lot of money and have really elaborate sets and costumes, and perhaps most importantly, huge crowds of people. The Italian epic films love to work with crowds and just, having this idea of scale and, massive armies and, um, yeah, it's usually armies. I don't have a visual of that. But in any case, the height of this is really a 1914 film called Cabiria by Giovanni Pastrone, which, as you can see, has these extremely elaborate sets. The left is people walking into the Temple of Moloch, which is one of the settings in the earlier part of the film, which is set at, this is in Carthage. And then the second shot there is the interior of the temple, right? So both really big sets using all of these extras and everything. So that idea of, of spectacle, of sort of grandeur and huge scale is really associated with Italian film right from the beginning. So at the time of World War I, Italy was one of the three biggest film producing countries in the world. And, that would be France, the US, and Italy. After World War I, the US really becomes the dominant force in the world, but Italy is still fairly strong as in its film industry. You don't see a huge amount of advancement in the 20s until you get the introduction of sound in the late 20s, and you start seeing Italian sound films then in the early 30s. And this is also, of course, during the fascist period. You do see the fascist regime pick up on some of these older films. As you might expect, they're interested in using the Roman epic. There's a big epic called Scipio Africanus, which was kind of meant to work up support for Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. But in general, the the other side of things, right? I guess in general, they're not super propagandistic. The other films you see during that time are just kind of light, comedic, trying to present a country that feels modern, that is kind of imitating the technical progress of American films. And somebody asked in the Q&A, where were these films made? The biggest film companies were in Rome and in Turin. So the one that I have the clips up right here of, Cabiria, is made by Itala, which was a Torinese studio. Most of the other big ones would have been made in Rome, so it's one of those two. And there is film production in either in other places, in Milan and in Naples as well, but it's really Rome and then Turin that are dominating in those early years. So when we reach the end of World War II, we kind of reach a point where there's a new consciousness of Italian cinema on the world stage. And this comes about as what was called the Neo-Realist Movement. And part of why this is important is because these are films that are really meant to be these kind of rough, unadorned pictures of everyday life in Italy, and specifically at the moment when they're made, right? They're looking at the lives of people in Italy after World War II. So you can really see a reaction here, right? It's not about grandeur. It's not about spectacle. It's about grit. It's about the little things. And that's a big switch away, right, from the fascist and also pre-fascist fascination with scale, grandeur, spectacle, majesty, exotic historical locales, right? So there's a really significant shifting of gears that happens at this point. And it's that attention to the present, and in particular to kind of, what we could call a sort of social diagnosis of the present, right? Not so much, what's happening on a large scale, so much as how individual people respond to it, right? And in all the films that we'll look at, that I'll talk about from 1960, they're very much responding to the, economic and cultural developments of the time, but always looking at those through very specific characters, which is something you get in most neo-realist films as well. As far as the connection between Italian opera design and the films, yeah, there's an absolute continuity. I mean, opera is one of the main sources of visual inspiration for those early films. You get people who direct and stage operas who are also working in film. You get filmed versions of the operas. So absolutely, it's probably the most important reference point. And yeah, as far as like studios go, you you generally do have a fair amount of continuity in terms of large studios in Italy over time, but it's not as, it's not like in America, right, where you had just 5 sort of dominant studios that produced pretty much everything for decades and decades. It's a little bit less stable than that, but you do have some companies that last for a considerable amount of time. Usually they end up merging with other companies or sort of closing and being renamed. So it's hard to keep track. But in any case, there are larger studios, but there are also kind of more impromptu, smaller productions as well. So these are, kind of the 2 most famous neo-realist films. Open City by Roberto Rossellini is a film that's looking specifically at the Italian resistance to the Nazis in World War II. So it's very much this kind of broad historical, you almost want to say epic, even though it's kind of an epic of everyday life. Whereas Bicycle Thieves is just about a poor man, right, who's just gotten a job that requires him to have a bicycle, which of course gets stolen as soon as he gets it out of being pawned. So 2 really different approaches here. One is kind of the national historical film. The other is really about the little people. But even in Open City, you have that element of, real Italians, working class Italians, that are really the main focus of the film. So there are 2 things that I just wanted to remark on about these films that is particularly relevant for what I'm going to get to in the 60s. The first I've already mentioned, right, which is really that commitment to social exploration, right? Not always necessarily criticism, right? But that film has a duty to show what people are experiencing in their everyday lives, right? That it's generally best if it's about the present. And there's a famous French film critic, Andre Bazin, and when he was trying to explain what made Italian films from the 40s and 50s so great, one of the answers that he gave is, when you watch an Italian film, you can pinpoint it to the year. Where when I watch a French film, I could, it could go a decade in either direction. And I mean, what he was saying there was really that, these films are so immediately responding to, historical change in a really rapid way, that they always feel really closely connected to a greater whole. And they're almost always concerned with that, right? These aren't just stories that are interested in like individual psychology or romance or something like that. So that's one thing, is just the kind of social orientation, the need to respond to what's going on in the immediate present. And then the other thing that you find in these films, particularly in the Bicycle Thieves, is a weak plot. And what I mean by that is, there is generally a story that we follow throughout the film, but it's not a rapid story with lots of changes taking place or a lot of dramatic confrontations. There's a lot of dead time. Bicycle Thieves is a film where there's a lot of wandering and waiting. There's one point in the film where the rain starts to fall, and the father and the son who are looking for the bicycle, they just go and sit, and they're under kind of a roof eave that's hanging over them to keep them dry from the rain, and we just stay there for a couple minutes and wait for the rain to stop, right? So these are films that have dead time, they have empty moments, they don't have rapid action, and they don't have what you usually find in Hollywood storytelling, and indeed in most storytelling, right, which is a really strong kind of cause-effect chain from scene to scene. The scenes can be much more episodic. As far as financial success with all of these things that I've talked about so far, the historical epics I was showing at the beginning were very financially successful. At that point, actors would not have been a draw. People wouldn't have known the actors or the names of the actors in the films. Often they weren't listed in the credits. But you do get, in Italy, you also get a lot of innovation in the area of stars and building film around stars right after this. So that's kind of another subgenre of film from the 1910s, not the historical epics, but the films that are basically built around the image of a particular star. By the time you get to Italian neorealism, you don't really have either of those things. Some of the films are financially popular, but that's not necessarily the norm. There were a lot of people who sort of felt like, well, why, aren't Italians making more entertaining blockbuster films? Because, those would make us more money and they're a lot more fun than, depressing films about post-war poverty. But in any case, these films garnered a huge amount of attention worldwide, and also really acted as a kind of way for Italy to rebuild goodwill after the war. So then when we get up to 1960, which is what I'm going to talk about today mostly, things are very different in Italy than they had been 12 or 15 years earlier. In the immediate post-war period, right, of course, you have enormous economic and political instability. You have a very damaged country. And, not that that is necessarily all eradicated, but you have an absolutely huge economic growth in Italy beginning in the mid-50s up to the early 60s. And, if you just look at the increase in GDP over that time, it's enormous. Standards of living are rising enormously. The economy is really shifting to a more export-based manufacturing economy. You have mass migration from rural areas into cities. And I think, the other really big thing to add there, right, is this is all a kind of Americanization, right? It comes along with the introduction of American consumer culture into Italy. So by the 60s, and these films are part of the reason why, the ones I'm going to talk about, Italy really does have this reputation, right? People don't associate it with like, oh, the destruction of World War II. They associate it with, modern, luxurious lifestyles and, pleasure and hedonism. Kind of a lot of the things that, Italian industries tried to sort of build a brand for Italy, right, during this period as a place of, luxury, artisanal goods, pleasure, sensuality, right, all of these kinds of characteristics. So we're in a very different Italy. And there's, of course, the question of how that transforms things for people on a material level. But the three films that I'm looking at are really more about what that sort of newfound wealth and prosperity and kind of, adoption of a more sort of Americanized style consumer economy, what that does to people, what it does to relationships, and kind of, you could even say what it does to the soul, I think would be a reasonable word for the directors that we're looking at. So I want to look at three films from 1960, and these are all by really major Italian directors. First one is Rocco and His Brothers by Luchino Visconti. One thing about a lot of these films is that they don't necessarily have an all-Italian cast. The star of this film, who plays Rocco, the title character, is Alain Delon, who is, of course, a French actor. He's dubbed in Italian. This is pretty standard, particularly with French actors, sometimes German. Sometimes that can be for reasons of co-production with another country, which is not the case with this. Oh, it is the case with this film. Yes, it's a French-Italian co-production. But in any case, Visconti was a director who had made his debut actually right at the very end of the war. His first film, Ossessione, Obsession, was more or less completely suppressed. And some people consider it to be one of the first neo-realist films, but it's basically this kind of gritty crime drama. It's adapted from a book by James M. Cain, the American novelist, The Postman Always Rings Twice. But then after that, he got more into these films that sort of had a more social angle. The big neo-realist film by Visconti is one called La Terra Trema, The Earth Trembles, and it's about Sicilian fishermen. But then after that, he does go in this direction of producing these bigger budget, kind of, more opulent or grand films. He produces a film called Senso, which is set during the 1860s in Venice, which is, it's a film that's all about opera. It's staged in an opera house and includes scenes from La Traviata, no, sorry, Il Trovatore, just because somebody asked about opera earlier. And a lot of people were like, well, you're not a neo-realist anymore, right? You're getting into all these big fancy colors and crowd scenes. So Visconti's not afraid of that. But in this film, Rocco and His Brothers, he puts together that sort of big epic scope with the social concerns of neo-realism. And when I talk about the epic scope, I should mention that all of the films I'm talking about are very long. I think this one is the longest. It's about 3 hours exactly. So anyway, the premise of this film is that it's about a family, the Parondi family, who are migrating from, I believe it's Catania, but I could be wrong. They're migrating from southern Italy to Milan and struggling to fit in there, to make their way financially, but also to culturally adapt. And it's a film that really reminds us a lot of the huge cultural gap separating Italians from the South with those living in the cities, particularly, a northern modern city like Milan. So as the title would suggest, it's primarily focused on a group of brothers. And I was talking a minute ago about how in neorealism, right, you get this kind of weakening of the plot. You don't have a single sort of through line or you know, single action or goal that is driving the whole thing. And in the case of this film, it doesn't do that either. But what it does instead is it gives a kind of bigger choral narrative. And the film is divided into chapters. And each of the chapters has the name of one of the brothers, right? So there's this idea that we're seeing a story of a bunch of different people, different perspectives. Of course, the funny thing is that the chapter titles don't necessarily align with the main focus, but it's kind of his way of saying, like, look, this isn't one story. This is a bunch of different stories that kind of intersect and give us a bigger picture of what the experience of this family would be like moving to Milan. So here, this is not I wasn't able really to find any particularly good clips from this film, but I do want to at least have people watch the trailer. So I'm going to put a link. I'm going to put a link that in the chat right now, and people can watch that. So this is quite short. This is a trailer that was produced for a recent restoration in of the film in 2015, and it's a little under 2 minutes long. So I'll go ahead and paste that in and give people a couple minutes to watch that. All right, I'll just start again in about 30 seconds to give people a chance to finish up. As far as watching the whole film goes, there was a recently restored edition. I think it should be fairly easily available. You won't find it on Netflix, but on Amazon, you can probably purchase it through YouTube. It's not going to be on one of the free streaming services, though, I don't think. Possibly if you have a Criterion channel, but I'm not 100% sure if it's on there either. So, you know, you get a sense from the trailer kind of, you know, about the kind of territory the film covers in terms of people from the South adapting to life in Milan. You also see that boxing is a major part of the film. So both both Rocco and his brother Simone are boxers, and part of the significance of this is that it's one of the only professions that's really open to them where they're going to be able to make much money. And of course, what boxing does, right, is it kind of destroys your body. So that's a big theme in the film, right? It's just kind of the physical toll that it takes on them. But more important than that is the interplay between the different brothers who kind of represent different attitudes towards this situation. So the biggest two characters are Simone here on the left and Rocco, who is wearing his gymnasium training shirt on the right. And Simone is kind of the brutish, cruel, abusive one, basically. He's the one who first gets into boxing. All he really wants is to get rich quick, essentially, right? To live the life of a rich person, or what he imagines that should be like. And so he doesn't hesitate to steal, double cross people. He's extremely in debt, right? He's an example of somebody who comes into this situation where all of these things, the acquisition of all this material wealth is possible, and it's entirely corrupting. At the same time, you can also see his attitude as one that is definitely a holdover from, say, for example, the norms around sexuality and the treatment of women in the South. You see that one exchange in the film where Claudia Cardinale says, it's actually to the other brother I don't have a picture of here, right? With me, you have to ask every time, right? Because he's saying something like, well, my mom says when you want a woman, you should just take her. So that's a tension that comes up. So Simone is kind of the bad brother, right, is descending further and further into, crime and self-destruction. And Rocco, meanwhile, is kind of the spiritual brother, right? He's the saint. He's very explicitly positioned in this way, and he wants to save Simone. He believes that he can redeem him. And so, on one hand, he's a much more sympathetic character, right? But you also see how much over the course of the film that his kind of belief, right, that, this is the most important thing in the world, to save or to redeem or to help my brother, ends up being extremely destructive to the people around him, particularly to Nadia, who is the woman you see in the trailer, who is the love interest for both brothers. And then finally, we have a character who we do not see very much, precisely because you'll see why his story would not be very interesting, and that's Ciro, the next to youngest brother, who simply works in the Fiat factory. And so, that is really the only alternative, or the only option here, right, that's shown as a viable one, right? What do? You go and work in a factory. And we see at the end of the film that he's going to be involved in some form of labor organizing. So we have Rocco and Simone, both who, don't really adapt. Rocco ends up, well, I won't tell you because that will spoil the end of the film. And you have Ciro, who does, but the fact is, he's a lot duller. We don't get excited about his story, and it's not a film that ends making us feel very hopeful about the future, or at least the future of this particular family. So whereas Visconti deals with working class people, with migrants from the South to Milan, the other two films I was going to talk about both really deal with the wealthy elite. There's just a couple more pictures. Rocco's on the roof of the Duomo, the cathedral in Milan, kind of associating him with the spiritual. And then you see, the kind of not very clean shaven Simone with Rocco's hand covering his mouth. So as a contrast, the second film I wanted to talk about, Laventura by Michelangelo Antonioni, is about, the leisure class. It's about people who don't have to work. We learn a little bit about where they get their wealth. The main male character in the film is involved in architecture. He basically provides estimates for buildings, and he finds this to be, not the most exciting thing in the world. It's made very clear in the film, right, that there is a price to be paid for wealth and kind of, easy success, which is that, you kind of leave your dreams behind. You just adapt to the world and figure out kind of what makes things the easiest for you. And that idea, right, that this prosperity and, what looks from the outside like, pure pleasure is completely emotionally and spiritually draining for people, that it just kind of leaves us as shells and makes us more and more dehumanized. So the story of the film is interesting because it sort of starts out feeling like there's going to be one plot, but then famously that plot is not where the rest of the film goes. So about the first little bit under an hour of the film, or about an hour of the film, is mostly set on a volcanic island. And our group of tourists are, visiting there. They're on their yacht, and there's a young woman named Anna, who's the one in the coat and the poster here, who suddenly disappears, right? So they're out on this volcanic island in the middle of nowhere. Where did she go? We might hypothesize that she committed suicide. That's really, or she died accidentally and fell into the sea. The fact is, we don't ever know. So it seems like it's going to be a mystery, right? It's going to be about what happened to this girl. But then it really ends up being about the relationship between her best friend, the blonde woman played by Monica Vitti that you see here, and her boyfriend, Sandro. So they're kind of dealing with her absence, but really, what unfolds in all of this is the weakness of the connection between all these people, right? That Anna, who's basically Sandro's fiance, can disappear, and 2 days later he's forgotten about her and just wants to start having an affair with Claudia, her friend. So I'll talk a little bit more about that idea of disconnection and lack of communication. But I wanted to talk about where the film kind of moves away from the strict kind of realism that you find in Visconti. And what I mean by that is, particularly if you look at landscape and architecture, in Antonioni's films, these things really reflect the interior state of the characters, right? They're not just settings, they're also a way of making visible let's say, a kind of way of feeling or existing in the world. Okay, so people who are having issues with the sound going over the clip, I think if you just close YouTube, that should go away. So I was talking about the volcanic island. I have some images for that. Okay, so this is a good example of what I was talking about. In the first image, you have Claudia up on a cliff above the sea, right? You could sort of think of that sea as about, fear, inner turmoil, and really kind of trappedness, right? Not really having anywhere to go. Then in the image below, this is when all of the people in the party of the woman who's missing are searching for her. And you'll notice that they're just these tiny little figures, right? They seem to be dwarfed and insignificant when they're placed in this setting with the island around them. And you also notice that they're very distant from one another. They wouldn't really be that close to one another. She doesn't actually fall, and it is shot on the actual volcanic island, so that's not a studio that you see in the image there. So that's kind of the key setting of the film, right? Just this desolate, barren place. There's almost no vegetation. People easily kind of get lost and separated from one another. There's just not a whole lot of human connection going on. So let's see. This idea of kind of, the trapness or lostness, and I'll show you a clip in a minute, which will give a better sense of this, is also really enhanced by the dead time used here. Lots of moments of silence. It's a film where there are many scenes where people don't say much of anything at all to one another, where we just kind of see the wind blow through their hair, or, listen to the sea roaring beneath them. They tend to be shown very small, as you see in the shot below, right, kind of dominated by the landscape. And so there's always this kind of eerie feeling of like solitude and loneliness. And there's a scene, which is the next one that I'm going to share with you, where the boyfriend of the disappeared girl and Claudia, her friend, are driving through Sicily. And at this point, they are, kind of looking for clues about where she would have gone, but they're also kind of just interested in themselves at this point too, and have given up on finding her. So this is an example of how you get that same kind of creepy, barren environment when they are outside of the island, right? Where we are somewhere where there is a human civilization. So before I say anything about that, I'm gonna give you the clip and let you watch it first. This one is about 3 minutes long, so hopefully that will work for everybody, and I'll get back to you in about 4 minutes after people have time to watch that. Somebody asked about the black and white. That's pretty standard still. Color doesn't really become standard in Italian films until the mid 60s, which is pretty, I mean, obviously there have been color films before that, but even in the United States, color still isn't standard in the 50s. Some big budget films of certain genres are going to be made in color, but it wouldn't really have been a particularly, wouldn't have been something that would have been a choice that would have been strange at the time. I think the filmmakers that we're looking at, well, Visconti actually made a color film in 1954. Fellini made his first, well, he did a short in 62, I believe, and then he did a full color film in 65, Antonioni in 64 too. So they switched to color pretty much right after this. So as far as that scene goes, I mean, I think that gives you a pretty good sense of that slowness, the dead time, the smallness of the characters in the landscape, and also the way that Antonioni uses buildings, right? I mean, we have what seems to be a fairly new, development here, and nobody lives there, and it has this very kind of forbidding, sterile feel to it, right? All of the hard right angles, which is very much a feature of fascist architecture, um, but the barrenness of it, just the sense that it feels otherworldly or out of place. It doesn't feel like an organic human community, and of course there's no people in it, right? But that's kind of usually what Antonioni is doing when he uses modern architecture, which he does all the time, right? Which is kind of a way to show this environment that feels completely inhospitable to human beings, right? It's not really that different than being on this bleak island. If anything, maybe it's a little bit creepier or worse, even because it seems like there should be people there, but there are not. Um, so yeah, in that particular scene, right? I mean, you also get kind of the sense of how this is also about a lack of communication, right? Like people don't live among other people. They're all just kind of these little self-contained units. So one of the questions that the film is asking, is there any way around it, right? I mean, is there really a possibility of any kind of deep emotional connection between people? And there's maybe just a little tiny note at the end of the film that one could read as optimism, although it's very up for interpretation. And that happens when, so at this point, Claudia and Sandro are a couple, right? I mean, presumably they are committed to one another. And he goes down from their hotel room and sleeps with a prostitute in the lobby. And she finds him, outside in the morning. And he's sitting on this bench, and she just puts her hand on the back of his head. And so, it really depends on how we read that gesture. Does that mean there is still some kind of connection possible between these individuals? I think it does, even if it's only, and the film deals with this idea more too, only in the sense that one of the things that we all share is our solitude and alienation, right? That's kind of what brings people together, ironically. Somebody put a question about Visconti, which I'll come back to. I want to just move on to La Dolce Vita so we don't run out of time. So the last film I wanted to talk about was La Dolce Vita by Federico Fellini, which is, commercially way more successful than the other two films. It was really, pretty much a smash hit worldwide, and it's just this, key cultural touchstone of Italy and Italian cinema. And here too, right, we're dealing with the wealthier classes, but our main character, Marcello, is actually, he's like a gossip journalist, right? So he moves with people in the upper echelons of society, but he's not exactly in it. And you kind of see him get more and more drawn into that lifestyle throughout the course of the film. And like the other films, I mean, again, to go back to the question of plot structure, there's no linear plot. There's not really a single story that we follow throughout the film. It's divided into fairly distinct episodes that kind of all have their own little stories. And I should say that a lot of these, particularly Fellini, also Rossellini, sometimes Visconti, there's a sense of the short story as something that they're working with too, right? These kind of small narratives that are then put together, right, rather than having one sort of single longer story. So we don't know how much time passes between the episodes, but we can see that Marcello, our main character, is getting sort of more and more inhuman, right? The way he treats other people, the extent to which he believes in love and higher ideals. And he's basically just, kind of a hedonistic drunk by the end of the film. I mean, he's quite literally dehumanized and dehumanizing. So again, like Antonioni, this is a film that's seeing this kind of, modern consumerist hedonistic lifestyle as something that is emotionally and spiritually destructive. But in Fellini, it's also a lot more fun. There's a comic element to the film, and there's a greater ambivalence, right? I mean, even though in this film, it's hard to think that he's not condemning the kind of lifestyle he's showing, there are also things that are quite, appealing about it. And that's one of the reasons why the film was successful, right? Because people want to go see incredibly fancy parties and, things that get into territory in terms of depicting sex that you wouldn't get in an American film at the time, right? I mean, there's so many things about the film that are pleasurable and appealing, even though, the way that it kind of comes down on what it's presenting is negative. So there's that as a difference. The other difference is that this film really does this through the lens of Catholic iconography. And a lot of the scenes in the film you could kind of see, I don't know if it's quite the right word, but as parodies of Catholic motifs, right, where their kind of sanctity is being challenged. One of the really famous ones is the scene where Marcello and Silvia, who's an actress who's visiting, are bathing in the Trevi Fountain, which you could certainly see as a kind of a parodic baptism, and then she herself as a kind of parodic Madonna, right? The idea that the movie star becomes the worshipped figure in the modern world, that they have this kind of, superhuman or otherworldly quality to them. There's a scene shortly after Silvia, the actress, arrives where she visits the Vatican, and she's wearing a very sort of clerical looking dress and climbing the stairs of St. Peter's, right? So kind of that idea that, celebrity culture is what replaces religion in modern life. Another really explicit place where you see this is in a sequence where Marcello is covering a story about two children who are supposedly having visions of the Virgin Mary. And when he goes to check it out, you see in the second still here, it's just a media circus. It does not appear to be particularly sincere. It's really just kind of set up to make a good TV show, and really to make money, right? You feel like this is kind of a travesty of something that should be spiritual. But at the same time, and this gets back to the ambivalence, Marcello's wife is there as well, and she's watching this. And at one point she says something like, well, if people believe in it, does it really matter if it's true or not? Right. So, I mean, there is a way where, one of the things that Fellini is asking, and I think that his answer to this question is ultimately no, but he is kind of asking the question of, can you retain something like faith or sacredness, if there's still belief, right? Even if the thing itself that you believe in is not actually, legitimate, that it's, a celebrity or something like that. So here too, right, there doesn't really seem to be any way out. And somebody asked about the character of Steiner, who is a character in the film who kind of represents someone who wants to block out this modern hedonistic world in favor of, music, poetry, history, philosophy. And, Marcello looks at him and he sort of thinks, well, maybe that's the way you do it, right? I should have been a sort of intellectual, artistic guy with my family, having this bohemian salon. But as we see in the film, that doesn't work either. You can't hide from all of this. You can't build it up, right? Because what's behind that desire to retreat that Steiner has is, as he says, the idea that, we could all die in a nuclear war any minute, right? How do you even go on living? How do you have children and raise a family when you feel like the apocalypse is coming any day? That's actually something you also see in Antonioni's film, L'Eclisse, The Eclipse. So yeah, I don't think it's, well, I won't tell you what happens to Steiner, but it's bad. Yeah, just one other thing about the religious imagery. I'm just going to show one last clip here, which is actually the very beginning of the film. And this is an image where Marcello is on a helicopter that is delivering a statue of Christ. And I think, the whole film is kind of already summed up in this initial scene. So this will be the last clip we'll watch. I'll put that in now. And again, this one is about 3 minutes long. So the film kind of announces its premise in this opening scene, right, through these two things that are being put together. Well, actually, three things, right? The statue of Christ, right, which would seem to be this sort of miraculous vision, right? He's flying through the sky over Rome. Then beneath him, we have the Roman ruins, right, the pagan level, and then up above, the modern level of the helicopter, right, which is kind of supplanted, an angel or a god or something like that. In any case, these things that don't really go together, right, but that represent a kind of historical layering. And so, we're thinking, how do these things relate, right? How does the modern relate to the ancient and the Christian? And the answer here, seems to be, again, right, that they are degraded in some sense, or at least the Christian is, right? basically Marcello up in his helicopter is using the statue of Christ to pick up women on the rooftop and get their phone numbers, right? So we move immediately from the sky, from the sacred, from the historical and the traditional to, let's pick up some women casually, right? So this total sort of dissonance between those levels. The ancient level that was also there, right, in addition to the Christian one, and Fellini tends to treat that as something that is in some ways more intact. You do see, in some of the scenes where he'll show partying and party scenes, that you get the sense that he's trying to recreate, right, like a Roman bacchanal or something like that. And he does later make the film Satyricon, which is about ancient Rome in a very outlandish kind of way. But again, right, it's a film that largely, I think, ends up being pessimistic. There is a girl that Marcello meets at one point in the film who kind of represents innocence, right? Somebody who's, not tainted by this world, or who still has a future, which he feels he doesn't really have. And at the end of this drunken party, at the end of the film, he goes out with his friends onto the beach and he sees her calling to him. And she's fairly far away. She's across this little bit of water that's blocking them, and he can't hear her anymore, right? So there's a pretty explicit meaning there that he's lost, right? There is no way out of this kind of hell that he's found himself in now. Do we feel like this is a horrible tragedy? Maybe not as much as we do in Visconti. But we also don't get that kind of gesture of consolation, right, of the hand on the shoulder or the head in Antonioni. Instead, we get this expression from Marcello. Oh, it is what it is, right? I mean, maybe there's no way out of it. Maybe we should just enjoy ourselves and, agree that we're never going back to pre-modern times. Okay, so I will stop there, and hopefully we still have time if people have additional questions. I tried to answer a bunch of them as people were posting them throughout, but I think there are probably a few that I still missed. Were the films made in different parts of Italy? Visconti was based in Milan, and that film is filmed in Milan. He's from Milan. Antonioni and Fellini, those would have both been films produced by Roman film companies. Actually, the one thing that I mentioned Naples, but actually the studio that produced Rocco and his brothers is Titanus, which was actually a Neapolitan studio. So it's actually, a Neapolitan studio rather than a Milanese one, despite being shot in Milan. Any other questions? And certainly I would recommend watching all of these films. I know some people already have. They're all available now in recently restored editions. They're easy to get through the library. You can stream them. Oh, somebody asked earlier about the Visconti film White Nights, or Notte Bianchi, which is a film he did in the late 50s with Marcello Mastroianni, which is an adaptation of a Dostoevsky story. And I think I sort of referenced this before. Visconti moves around a lot stylistically. That film is kind of more of an example of something that you don't really see so much in Rocco and his brothers, which is his theatricality, right? The sense that he often imagines sets as though they're stage sets. Even his direction and the way he does blocking is very informed by theater, but it's also based on a short story. It's also very visual and cinematic, right? I mean, he's really an artist who puts all these different arts together, right? I kind of feel like he collects the art of the early 20th and 19th centuries and kind of merges them into one. Rocco and his brothers is also based on Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, and Thomas Mann is a big reference point for Visconti as well. He later makes a film of Death in Venice. Mean Streets influenced by Rocco and his brothers, absolutely. Scorsese is very, very deeply influenced by Rocco and his brothers. And the choral narrative, the sort of intersection of spirituality and crime and passion, right? I mean, all of these things are very, very present in Scorsese's films. And you might have noticed that on the trailer, it was his endorsement, right, saying, "Oh, now you can watch Visconti's masterpiece, as it was meant to be seen." Um, as far as Cinecittà, that was the big film studio. Everything you see in La Dolce Vita, not everything, but almost everything is a set. They recreated, Via Veneto and the Trevi Fountain, right? All of these landmarks of Rome in a studio, which again is kind of this interesting way of saying, well, it's the real thing, but we've got a fake version now, right? I mean, not in the sense of degrading it, but in sort of blurring that line between, modern consumer culture and film and reality. Um, as far as evolution during the rest of the 60s, these three filmmakers are still pretty dominant forces throughout the 60s. And then you have younger people emerging, filmmakers like Ermanno Olmi, Pierpaolo Pasolini, who had previously been a poet and a novelist, Bernardo Bertolucci. So this is really kind of the beginning of a really incredibly fertile 10 or 15 years where you just have, an incredible amount of stylistic innovation in Italian cinema, which, eventually kind of peters out. And there are various reasons for that. I mean, one is questions of commercial viability. It has to do with the Italian film industry overall and its financial success, which drops off in the 70s, as it does so many places due to economic crises of the early 70s. And then the other thing that starts happening in the mid 70s and really takes off in the 80s is that television and film become really inextricably linked. So it's actually RAI, the Italian broadcasting company, that is financing a lot of the films, right? They're buying them for TV, they're shown theatrically, but eventually what this ends up doing is it kind of blurs the two together. A lot of the films that are being financed are films that are meant to be seen on TV by a wide audience. They're usually lower budget. So that causes a lot of changes in terms of the kind of films that we've seen. Let's see, a couple of other things. What is this period of Italian film called? It isn't, that's part of what I don't know what to call it, right? Because some people will say things like, Italian new cinema or Italian new wave, right? Which those aren't really terms that are used that frequently. So yeah, I mean, we could use a nice convenient label for it, but there really isn't one in the way there is for, French New Wave or something like that. There's also a question about the scene in La Dolce Vita where Marcello meets his father. Oh boy, that's a pretty depressing scene. I think there's a lot of things that you get there about why Marcello is the way that he is in terms of his father's sort of absence in his life. The father is also kind of shown as this hedonistic character, but he's also shown to be impotent. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sort of explanatory power in that scene. I'm not sure how I would think about it linking up with the overall sort of celebrity culture a motif. I'd have to think about that more. Sergio Leone. Leone really comes out of a totally different part of Italian filmmaking, which is the really commercial genre film, right? So he gets his start in these Roman sword and sandal epics, right? Which go back all the way to the 1910s, which had a kind of rebound in popularity in the 50s. His father was involved in the film industry too and was a director. So yeah, he's in kind of a different sector of the industry, right? That's much more commercially oriented, and that's how he gets his start. But his style is noticed as being so distinctive that he very quickly kind of gets moved over, at least in some sense, to the art cinema category. Although he's a good example of how a lot of Italian films of this era, that divide is not clear. It's very permeable. So yes, let's see, musicals. Boy, this is a good question. And there are a lot of Italian films where there will be songs that are featured, that might be sung by one of the characters or played in the film that, would then also be hits, and, people would buy the records. But musicals per se, right, of the American kind where people are, singing throughout the film, no, it's not really something that you see in Italy, interestingly enough. And then just, yeah, the other question about Antonioni. He is a filmmaker who, I think a lot of the changes that he goes through stylistically happen before his famous, Alienation trilogy with Laventura that we looked at. Because he starts off, working in a vein that's a little bit less sort of stylistically excessive, more in the neo-realist mode, and his early films go back to the 1940s, and then he gets this kind of, really distinctive personal style that we see in the three films he makes in the early 60s, L'Avventura, La Notte, and L'Eclisse. Then he moves into color with Red Desert, which is a fairly similar film to the first two. But then he leaves Italy, and his films become very, very different. He makes the film Blow Up in England, and then Zabriskie Point in the U.S. Also, a film called The Passenger in the U.S. And you certainly see some thematic and stylistic similarities, but I think what you lose is the real close connection to the immediate time. After you get that in Zabriskie Point, but then once you get to The Passenger, he only has a couple of films after that. I mean, Antonioni was around for quite a while, but okay. So just one other questions. Genesis of spaghetti westerns. Spaghetti westerns, essentially, Italy found out that they could cheaply produce films in genres that were pretty much guaranteed to sell, particularly in the US. The Western is one of them. Horror is a smaller one. They shoot them largely in Spain. They're usually pan-European productions. But yeah, those are really financially a big thing for the industry in the 60s, right? So we have all this, genre cinema, or sort of like low, cheaper cinema that is, really propping up the kind of films that we're looking at today. So, okay, so I think I'm out of time. Just thanks everyone again for attending, and thank you for your questions.